Thank you very much for being here in present and online as well. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this session today. We have many speakers, so I won't take much. So the event is book presentation that we decided to title A New Democratic Emergency. We have the pleasure to have Álvaro Oleart here with us. Researcher from ULB, the author of the book Democracy Without Politics, and we have an amazing panel of speakers. So we have 2 hours, and this is how we're going to do it. I will briefly present you today's speakers and how we're going to do this, and then I will leave the floor to Professor Kalypso Nikolaidis for her keynote, and then I will leave actually the floor to Virginia and then Álvaro for a little bit of introduction. So I am very happy to be to moderate this session because I read the book, studied the book actually last semester, Democracy Without Politics, and this is a very thought-provoking book that I really suggest you reading if you're of course interested in the topic, as I think you are. I think it's very interesting because it's challenging the knowledge that we have, the instruments of citizen participation. And it's really, I think, opening and inviting for further research and discussion on the topic. Álvaro did an impressive research on looking at the Conference on the Future of Europe and the European Citizens panels, and looking at these 2 case studies, he really argues that the EU's approach is depoliticized in these at least two cases. So the process, at least by design, is meant to include citizens, to be participatory, but in reality is avoiding a real political debate and a real contestation. So it's sort of a cherry picking that the Commission is doing the expertise and the knowledge of people instead of at least allowing for a real debate. I think this is really important. So these mechanisms of citizen participations are more technocratic than politicized. So here is where I want, and I hope that our discussion will start today. So we have Kalypso Nikolaidis, that is professor here at School of Transnational Governance, and also the scientific coordinator of the Democratic Odyssey. And so we give some introductory remarks today. And then we have Nicola Milanese, that is visiting fellow at the School of Transnational Governance, and also the founding director of European Alternatives, and I think also a subject of the research of the book, so that's a very interesting perspective that we have here. And then we have Virginia Fiume. Virginia is a policy leader fellow, a non-violent activist and co-founder of Humans, and she's also she's researching exactly on the themes that we are addressing today with the book and also with a discussion on democratic and non-violent participation. And then we have Nicolas Palomo, is a master's student here at the SDG, already finished, and a prospective PhD student. I also wanted to mention that Nicolas participated in the in writing the report of the European Parliament on the regulatory framework for citizen initiative instrument of direct democracy. And then last but not least, we have Mine Kosem, also a policy leader fellow here at school. She is from Turkey, but she's bringing, I think, an interesting lens to our discussion on gender. So, here now I leave the floor to Kalypso. If you want to come here, you can stay there. It's up to you. Do you also need a clicker? No, I don't think so. So I will leave the clicker to you.
Thank you, Gaia. Do we have microphones?
No,
we don't need microphones, do we? Right. Well, I want to first of all thank for so many. You have a lot of people here in our Hannah Arendt room, and isn't it appropriate that we are meeting in this Hannah Arendt room of ours to talk about truth and politics in some ways, which is in a way what your book is about. And thank you, Gaia, for the introduction. I certainly am not giving a keynote, and I didn't know until yesterday that I was even starting. I thought I was a discussant, but perhaps it's appropriate, and I'm very, very excited to hear everyone in this panel. That to say, to start with, that, well, I introduce here in several capacities, but first and foremost as a friend and colleague of Alvaro for many, many years, because I think one of the things that bring all of this panel together is that we're all what I kind of would call, one way or another, academic activists, trying to bring together, you know, the world of concepts about democracy, people, sovereignty, all these big words of ours, and kind of getting our boots dirty and observing, doing, you know, what it means to do not just citizen participation, but actual politics in various ways. We try. I'm not saying, you know, we don't necessarily succeed, but that's a mindset, and there is a sharing of the mindset. And that might be perhaps the only problem with this panel. I'm not sure there's a lot of counter, you know, or good old technocrats that are going to come and tell us, you know, nah. But that's fine, because we can have a conversation about how does what we are trying to all say and do, you know, can be most effective. So let me just simply say that at the first institutionally, the EUI cluster on democracy tries to bring together all sorts of research around the EUI and beyond. And so we're very, very happy to be able to discuss this book. And especially many of us with our hats as the Democratic Odyssey Project, because the book here and the conversations around the book are exactly what wants to feed our project, our Democratic Odyssey Project. That is an activist project. Jamie is here, project manager, and very much the engine of it all. And what we're trying to do is indeed, yes, a campaign, yes, democratic activism, but grounded in concepts, in thought, and this is why the book is so important, because if I can just say in a nutshell, it's very difficult to do what Alvaro has done in this book, which will bring two sides of the literature and thinking together. On one side, we have his critique of basically this lovely word that we all love, citizen participation. Who could be against it? Citizen engagement. Nobody. Anyone against it in the room? No? No. Well, you should be, actually, if you read Alvaro's book. At least you should be ready to subvert it. That's what he does. I mean, he deconstructs this lovely idea that somehow everybody seems to be after. And you're going to, of course, you know, guys already alluded to it, and you're going to say more, and everybody's going to discuss it. But in a way, I would call it a subterfuge. You know, the cunning of institutions, that they do these things that are not too dangerous for them. Oh, we bring in 200 citizens in Brussels and pay a hotel and travel and really nice food, so they're not going to be too mean to us, kind of thing. And it's a subterfuge. And you will say much more what is done, this whole idea of this is really taking all these atomized citizens' democracy, this disintermediation, so you'll say more, but it's very important for us, but it's difficult for us to hold that critique, because we do, at the same time, want to, you know, use it as a step in a ladder to go somewhere. So we want to use these institutions, and yet we want to be critical. So I think part of our conversation has to do with how do you hold this together? A radical critique of the kind of engagement that EU institutions do, and at the same time kind of embracing some of what's going on as an experiment. Indeed, an experiment you observe so closely, and we observe together, that it allows to do the book and say that something is going on, right? So that's one part of the conversation that we're going to have, thanks to Alvaro. And really, you know, a book that goes in great detail and gives us a lot of material fabric of what happens. So for the reader who hasn't been part of that process, you know, that you're giving them enough about it to understand what you're going on about. I mean, I might just simply here plug Nicolas, who's going to speak too, and now he just finished his master thesis on this topic, and everybody's going to read it at some point too. But we work together, and we have, there is a bit of an issue about what the word democracy is, because you talk about democracy without politics, but you also say it's not democratic, and we're going to have a conversation. We've had that conversation, we've written on it together, so that, looking very much forward to this. But it's not a disagreement on the substance of things. But just to flag for everybody, I really hope that we also spend some time in the second dimension of the conversation, which is really much more political theory, political philosophy. And that really hugely matters to me, not just because you discuss very thoroughly my theory of democracy, but that I would already be a good thing. And Daniela here in front is very much in that space, as well as others here. But really, on what theories, conceptual foundation, do we ground the critique of what's going on? And Alvaro has this great, concept of decolonial multitude. I was going to read your definition, but maybe you're going to read your definition in your presentation. I won't read the definition. You won't read the definition, but maybe I don't want to, you will speak more about.
Of course I will.
And this is very interesting because the word people, super important in this conversation. People and peoples. In fact, in the Democratic Odyssey, we want to build a people's assembly, people's plural, and people to define those who are just jumping up and down and saying we're at the bottom of the ladder of power, and we want to say that's the people. The problem, so we're happy with using the word peoples. I am happy using the word peoples in democracy, the plural of demos, democracy, because it's not an essentialist word. It's about indeed a multitude of people. But Alvaro would, and I don't want to paraphrase too much, but simply to give a glimpse that, but that's quite Hobbesian, Rousseauian, traditional, contractual, essentializing term. Peoples, we should be a bit wary about such a term. Why don't we go back to our dear Machiavelli, we're in the right place, and Spinoza, to talk about multitudes. It's a very much more fluid sense. Now, we could disagree on various things. First of all, whether these two terms, peoples and multitude, to the extent that peoples, not just national peoples, they can be all sorts of people, are they really opposite, or is there a multitude version of peoples? The extent to which someone like Hobbes, why did he really need a people? And that has to do with the mind. It doesn't have to do with the state and its power. It has to do with the fact that someone like Hobbes understood that he was very much part of a movement, a subjectivist movement in his time that meant that we can't really communicate very well. How do our brains actually connect? And it's fascinating. And I think very relevant to what we are discussing. We could have a conversation about Spinoza and the extent to which Spinoza, his multitude very much was, it couldn't be left to itself. You need institutions to channel the passions of the multitude, to organize the multitude, and boom, we're right back to their other notions of people. So we can have a whole conversation about how we understand the we in our democracy and the we that needs to express itself in political decisions, in decisions made by our complex Weberian states that affect our everyday life. Okay, what is that we, that collective that we would like to see empowered in our societies? Does it even matter if we call it peoples, multitudes, societies, Castoriadis, civil societies, network societies, etc. So that's one conversation. And then another conversation, which I hope we'll have, is the decolonial, adjective that you put in front of people. Because I think here at EUI, it's fair to say that, we have a long way to go, but we really are trying to globalize this place. And especially here at the Florence School of Transnational Governance, we have 36 countries representing, and I see some of our students here, but represented here. Many of them are in internships and elsewhere, but we're trying to be global. I don't think we completely succeed, and I'm not sure we completely succeed in being decolonial, although some of us try not to be Eurocentric. It is a mindset here, and I see you're looking up, Isma, at these frescoes are very colonial, especially in the other room. Or in fact, they're also about the tyranny of small differences, since this is the most important victory of Florence in its whole history against who? Anybody? Siena, the city that was the most similar to Florence in many different ways. And certainly, yes, so who is the other is very much here, and the other was more Siena than even the Ottoman Empire, which is represented in the other room. So we have variations on Eurocentrism. This was a parenthesis of just to prepare to pass on to you, Alvaro, to say that to bring these, I find it so important that you bring these conversations beyond simply asking, well, on our little European continent, how are we going to do this? No, how do we think of Europe within the global infrastructure of capitalism, legacy of colonialism? How does that impact and affect what is this European we? Can even there be a European we when there's so much of the other within Europe? And in these debates, I mean, I was just on Zoom on a debate with EPC in Brussels, and I'm the only one in 2 hours who said something about, well, we should look beyond Europe, or beyond Europe, outside Europe, and beyond Europeans inside Europe. It's just not there in that epistemic community. And that's something we want to change with the Democratic Odyssey, but I'm getting ahead of myself because I really do hope that after we hear Alvaro and everybody, we also want to ask, normatively and prescriptively, where do we go from here? So that's all I wanted to say in introduction, simply to say that thank you for being here and thank you for having written a fantastic book. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. And starting with you.
Thank you very much, Kalip. Now we have very short moment of interaction.
Yes, there is no event without slide nowadays. So we designed a little question to just create our collective moment of feeling. So the request is to log into the Slido.com with that code up there, and to write one or more words to describe how you feel when thinking about European democracy ahead of the next European elections. We are always thinking about election as the moment of democracy. I guess the reason why we're here is because we think it's also beyond that. But please share some words that we're gonna display in this amazing Slido, if I don't mess up too much. So the number is 6793694. You can also play at bottom if you want. 6793694. Also, the online audience is more than welcome to do so. And now I'm gonna switch to the.
Sorry, I didn't get the number. Could you please go back? I didn't get the number.
Yeah. So the number is 6793694.
The words are encouraging so far.
And let me share it on Zoom because otherwise we can't see it. Zoom. I can find the sharing button on Zoom. Here. Sorry, by doing. Okay. So Alvaro, this is your source of inspiration. And I want to finish. So disempowerment, frustration, disconnected, inclusion of multiple perspectives, nationalist, short-sighted, disempowerment, technocracy, elite leadership, disenchantment, boredom, defiance. There is a little tiny hope somewhere there. Scared, populism. So, it's time to Alvaro.
Yes, Alvaro, this is really a good way to start.
I couldn't think of a better way to start than with the word confusion. Well, thank you so much to everyone for being here. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about the book here. First, I would like to, of course, thank Virginia and Gaia for the organization, Calixto for the very nice introduction, and Nicolas, Nicolo, thanks for being here. Thanks a lot, and thanks to everyone for joining to this discussion. So, and also Florence is a particularly, I think, important kind of geographical place for the book, because I mean, not only the last session of one of the conference on the Future of Europe panels took place here, the one on democracy, precisely. Hans Jörg, you were there as well, Daniela, and so on. So that was very nice to share and to not only share that moment, but also come back to it after a little bit as well. Okay, so if you haven't seen the book, this is the book. I really like the cover, so I think I didn't have the opportunity to bring it here, but I think Nicolo has. So there's a proof that it actually there is such thing as a book, and I think in some ways the cover of the book already illustrates some of the things that are going on, right? And I chose this lock as a way to illustrate how the European Union is realizing that there is, and has realized for a long time, there's a problem with legitimacy, with democracy, and so on, and how it is looking for ways in which we can re-legitimize the European Union, while at the same time, in fact, it is locking up the possibilities of actually doing something different. Right, so there is this, in some ways, appearance that there's something very radical, something new that is going on. We're doing citizen panels, citizen participation, a bit what Calixto was saying. In reality, what we are doing is primarily reproducing the already status quo, but through different ways. So, in a nutshell, that's a little bit the argument that I put forward in the book. So just to, I don't really have to talk too much about the situation about how the EU works, because many people here know more than me, but basically at the European level, it operates in sort of a bubble, right? And there's certain codes that are going on, and all the actors that are involved, from obviously business lobbies, corporate interests, but also civil society organizations, operate in a very technocratic policy-making space. So if you want to influence policy-making in Brussels, you have to respond to public consultations, you have to attend stakeholder meetings, and so on. And in reality, beyond the European bubble and beyond the people that read Politico and so on, there's no European public sphere, there's no broader public debate on European issues, except for a few episodes that appear every now and then, right? So there's a little bit of a disconnection between what is going on in EU policy making and the public sphere or the public spheres at large. And I will come back to the concept of democracy without politics, because I really like how Vivian Schmidt puts it, that in the EU we have policy without politics, right? Meaning by that there is a meaningful policy making that is going on, and meaningful policies, but in fact there's little politics, there's little contestation, and a broader public sphere that in some ways holds accountable the decision making at the EU level. Now, for a long time, knowing that this was the situation, I think the EU and the European Commission in particular has heavily invested in European civil society actors. So since the late 90s, early 2000s, has invested a lot of money in building European civil society umbrella organizations that in some ways represent the interests of environmental organizations, trade unions, etc., right? At the same time, the articulation, the construction of these organizations has not necessarily led towards a broader European public sphere, because these organizations, even if they were NGOs, they have done is to simply adopt to the codes that the EU policymaking already had in its place. Right? So rather than in some ways operating as mediators between EU institutions and European citizens, in some ways these organizations have had a tendency to reproduce the elite and very technocratic policy-making processes that have driven EU politics for a long time. So realizing that, and also considering the context of Brexit in 2016, the UK leaves and votes to leave the European Union, I think there is a little bit of a conceptual change within the EU that says, well, you know, I think it is no longer possible. I mean, we can't really continue as we were doing. We need to make some changes. We need to, in some ways, connect better with European citizens. And how do we do it? Well, there's this idea. At the same time, well, in Ireland, there's the citizen assemblies on abortion and gay rights. Later on in France, we have the Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat. So within the EU, they says, well, you know, maybe we can, in some ways, reach directly to citizens, right? So rather than going through intermediators, so NGOs, trade unions, political parties, etc., let's just go and establish a direct sort of relation to citizens. And this is what I kind of call this kind of citizen turn. So Sabine Sauruger talks about the participatory turn that emerges throughout the 2000s, where within the European Union there's this norm accepted whereby we need NGOs to participate in the process, because otherwise it's not really legitimate what is going on at the European level. And here we go towards the citizen turn in the sense that increasingly the EU and the European Commission in particular is looking to reach out directly to citizens. And this is specifically represented through the citizen dialogues or the European citizen consultations that happened in 2018 and the Conference The Future of Europe. The Conference The Future of Europe, I think, in some ways is very illustrative of the broader European political dynamics, right? So we have in 2019 a Spitzenkandidaten process where it basically doesn't work. The no candidate from the Spitzenkandidaten works. So what do? Let's look for another candidate that is acceptable to all members of the European Council. They come up with von der Leyen. However, at the same time, von der Leyen has a deficit in terms of her legitimacy towards democracy in general, but more specifically towards the parliament. So von der Leyen comes up with this idea, you know what, I'm going to do a Conference The Future of Europe, that I'm going to promise that the parliament will have a leading role. Of course, this fails. The European Parliament doesn't get a leading role because the Council is afraid that the Parliament will recommend some things that they will not like. So in the end, we end up with an interinstitutional agreement and a Conference The Future of Europe that is co-led by the three institutions: Council, Commission, and Parliament. Now, at the same time, the conference, it was not only an interinstitutional. There were very interinstitutional kind of dynamics, and I'm happy to talk about them. But the more interesting part, of the one that I think was at least more new for me, was the citizen panels that were organized within the conference. So here they organized 4 panels, 200 people randomly selected in each panel, and each panel was dedicated to different topics. As you can see, all the topics are very broad, and they did this in 3 weekends. And basically, they expected each of the panels to come up with very concrete recommendations on each of the topics. Of course, you can already see that it is very difficult to have a quality debate on topics or in a panel that is that broad, right? I mean, if you only look at the panel 1 that encompasses economy, social justice, jobs, youth, sport, culture, education, digital transformation, and you have to deal with this in 3 weekends and come up with meaningful recommendations, yeah, of course, it's going to be very difficult. Beyond the specific kind of topics and the lack of a specific dilemma, so in Ireland, you would have abortion, right? Yes and no. You have, people that would advocate for yes, people that would advocate for no. You would deliberate. Here, there's not really such kind of a clear-cut dilemma. In addition for that, you also had, I kind of like this idea of the political construction of everyday citizens. There was a lot of discourse that was basically oriented towards, institutions are failing a little bit to represent. Instead, here we get a microcosm of society that is more representative than parliaments or than some institutions. And I think this is very interesting because in some ways this shifts the conception of the political agent from the collective, from parties, from NGOs, towards individuals. And this, I think, creates a lot of problems, especially when a lot of these individuals that were participating were not necessarily acquainted with European politics, with EU policy making. So in the end, if you look at a lot of the recommendations, many of them are either very general, they recommend things that already exist, or they recommend things that broadly the institutions are already doing in many ways. And of course, all this process is guided by the institutions, and it ends up in very technocratic dynamics. That's what kind of I situate with this idea of techno-deliberation. That you don't really have a meaningful deliberation between alternative choices. Mostly you have deliberation over wording of certain things, with recommendations that end up being very broad. Yeah, more education, more knowledge about how the EU works and so on. So that becomes, and also problematic contradicting recommendations. So for example, in the panel for EU in the world, you are saying, oh, we want more human rights, and you also say, we also want more Frontex. And of course, there's a tension between the two that is not resolved. This is the plenary of the Conference on the Future of Europe, which I also found a really interesting space, because the Conference on the Future of Europe plenary brought together citizens' participation, so people that participate in the panels. Out of the 200 that participated in each of the panels, 20 of them were kind of sent to the plenary. So it's all this group, and there they were put in working groups depending on the topic they were working on, and they were deliberating and discussing with MEPs, with members of national parliaments, with government representatives from the council. And what is very interesting is not only who is present, but also who is absent from here. And interestingly, civil society is basically playing no role at all. So you have a massive kind of delegation of European citizen panelists, and you basically have no civil society. You had 8 people from civil society. Out of those 8 people, 3 were from European Movement International, and they only got those 8 positions after they signed a letter from 150 organizations complaining that they were not there. So clearly there is this, I think, mentality increasingly going on, whereby the institutions are trying to replace some of these actors that would operate as mediators by sort of individual citizens. And surprisingly, most of the recommendations indeed are highly friendly to what the Commission is saying. I mean, funnily enough, after the conference, only a few months after, the European Commission made so the conference ended in May 2022. So in September, the Commission released the work program for 2023, which they said 80% of the work program for 2023 is based on the recommendations from the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was not false, but that only indicates that most of the recommendations from the conference were mostly aligned with what the EU is already and the Commission is already doing. Anyways, that was a sort of parenthesis. Now this trend is going to continue, and I think it has continued afterwards, because it ended in 2022. Since 2022, they organized 5 additional panels. This time it was not all EU institutions, it was the Commission specifically. Von der Leyen, who is interesting because she doesn't seem particularly interested in the panels, but she keeps investing in them. And in the State of the Union of 2022, she said that the panels will become a regular feature of democratic life. And to be fair, she has continued with this idea, with those panels. In addition, they have also, the European Commission has also created a competence center on participatory and deliberative democracy. This is interesting because the Commission basically had no expertise on deliberation, participation, and so on. So still today, all the panels are organized by private consultancies. So it's private actors that basically organize these panels. And I think with this competence center, in some ways, the Commission is trying to gather and articulate a little bit of in-house expertise in some ways, even though I don't think they will end up organizing anything, but at least they will have a little bit more knowledge, because now they rely basically entirely, they just subcontract the whole organizing to these actors. These are the 5 panels that the Commission has organized after the conference. So December 2022 started the food waste one, and then they do virtual worlds, learning mobility, energy efficiency, and combating hatred. Now, the interesting thing is that a little bit the critique that the Commission has taken is, okay, we received a lot of critiques that the panels in the conference were too broad, and they were too broad. I mean, I showed you the topics, right? So we will choose specific topics. Now, there's also a problem with being very specific, which is, I mean, is there really a public debate on food waste, right? Like, I mean, one has to wonder whether that's the case, because in the end, it follows a purely technocratic logic. Is there a DG that is interested in doing this? Do we have a policy that is at the stage in which it makes sense to organize a citizen panel? And following this technocratic logic, the logic is to sort of what they call embed citizen panels in policy making. So basically to integrate some of the feedback that appears from the panels into the policies. The problem, of course, is that, I mean, looking at it, I mean, they not only guide the process, is that the very laws, the very policies that they are drafting, basically they have already been drafted before the citizen panel starts. But even if that were not the case, you can see that all the panels reproduce the logic of the Commission. So, for example, the food waste panel, we have a debate the first day, the 16th of December, between stakeholders. And of course, they invite some businesses that you can imagine what they were saying. You know, it's all individual responsibility, blah, blah, blah. And they also invite some civil society. Of course, you have civil society, then there's a PowerPoint presentation. And then they used a PowerPoint in which this woman from this civil society had the image of a shopping list. Because of course, you know, if you take a shopping list to the store, you will not buy more things than you need. You also had another NGO that was from a food bank that was recommending, yeah, volunteer for food banks. So in the end, it's really reproducing this kind of dynamics, and we can see, I mean, we can talk about each of the panels, but basically all of them had this very consensus-oriented understanding of deliberation and ended up reproducing what the Commission is already doing. I mean, here, yeah, the shopping list. I mean, in the virtual worlds, they did basically a fair where different companies would show how, you know, virtual worlds, you know, how AI and how virtual worlds happen. It was basically a propaganda space in which different companies were showcasing their items, their products in some ways. They even invited, not only they invited the vice president of Renault in Europe, but they even played to the whole citizen panels a video made by Renault on the metaverse. Of course, you know, how the metaverse is helping them to be more efficient in their production of cars and so on. So it was genuinely embarrassing in some ways, because it really illustrates how the Commission uses these kind of processes to legitimize what they already want to do, right? And going back a little bit, so this is a little bit the empirical part, going back a little bit to the, okay, what does this mean for democracy, right? A little bit what Calypso was saying in her introduction of how do we kind of zoom out from these very specific kind of spaces, and how do we make sense of what does this mean for democracy? I think there's a lot of tensions. One of them is that, and I think this is illustrated by this article by Claudia Schwalisch, who used to be in the OECD, and now she has a consultancy, Democracy Next, and she wrote this article in which she reclaimed deliberative democracy and sortition with this title of a movement that's quietly reshaping democracy for the better. And I think here is where the main tension lies. Because there's a group of actors that think that you can improve democracy quietly, right? It's just about having better processes. It's just about, doing sortition the right way. And political parties, they are too polarized. They look too much to the short term. Basically, we need new ways of forming consensus, and it is much easier if you articulate this in citizen panels, right? So I think that is problematic because in some ways it's a tendency that delegitimizes collective actors. So trade unions, parties, civil society are not necessarily considered legitimate actors in this context. Of course, there's room. I mean, this might be the kind of end of the spectrum, right? And there's other ways of conceiving deliberation, but I think this is one of the tensions, the relationship between some of these spaces and collective actors. And then here is where I come with this idea of democracy without politics. Of course, I do think that democracy needs politics. And here, what I am trying to say in some ways is that the EU's imaginary, the imaginary upon which the panels and the citizen participation is constructed is a vision that envisages democracy as not needing to have politics. Democracy is about, just having these processes. The Conference on the Future of Europe, it's a success because the recommendations are good. It's kind of this very output oriented understanding. There's no articulation between the micro and the macro, and here I follow Hans-Jörg's also work, where the citizen panel, the citizen panel's relation, the mini public's relation to the broader public sphere is basically missing, and the main point ultimately ends up in being a sort of PR exercise for the EU to say, well, we are connecting with citizens. It's a different way of doing videos about how great the EU is. And a fun fact is that lately, I mean, of course, the EU and the Commission are aware that this is happening, right? Because no one is paying attention to the citizen panels. I mean, last weekend we had one of the citizen panels that ended. No one really noticed because no one is really looking, other than a few geeks like me, right? So the EU is noticing and the Commission is noticing that. So they said, well, it's true that no one is paying attention to the citizen panels. You know what we will do? Let's hire a few influencers that will come to the panels and they will spread awareness about the panel. This is actually happening, unfortunately. So I think it's a very problematic understanding of what democracy is. Now, just to come back to it, in some ways, these processes that I have described, basically they just reinforce how the EU works, this very depoliticized, technocratic dynamic. They just do it in a different way. While the conference and these panels might look like very innovative new things, in fact, if we look at the way in which their impact and their articulation to democracy, it is not really changing much. So that's why, in some ways, Vivian Schmidt's policy without politics, I think, represents very well what the EU is doing. That's why democracy without politics, in some ways, is an illustrative way of putting the imaginary upon which the EU constructs these processes. So basically, did the conference make a difference? Was it really a push for citizen participation for democracy? Well, you can imagine that the response is no. I mean, it's possible that some people would make a different argument. To me, if you articulate a democratic innovation of this sort without linking it up to the broader deliberative system, public sphere, as you want to call it, it's highly unlikely that you will have any meaningful kind of contestation, vibrancy of the public debate. Also, the European bubble that operated within the conference, it didn't really interact. So national political parties, trade unions, organizations, they were not involved at all. Even when national MPs were operating in the plenary, They were often, sidelined. They were participating, but not really. They were not coordinated, and so on. There's no mass politics. There's a vision of individual politics at heart. At the same time, it's true that for the conference, the kind of all-encompassing policy scope, so the fact that you touch upon every policy area that exists, that didn't make it any easier. You didn't zoom in on particular dilemmas. At the same time, the Commission's response of saying, okay, let's just narrow it down to very specific topics, it's also problematic because in the end, you're just legitimizing policies that you're already drafted, and hence, that's why you have this depoliticized conception of democracy. And I wanted to end on the note of the Palestine encampment that happened here in Florence, because I think in some ways, and coming a little bit to the tension that might exist between this type of deliberation within the panels, that this is how it happens, this is in the Commission. It's very technocratic. You have all these people that are coming in to draft very specific recommendations on this very specific topic. It frames itself as very neutral, non-political, very consensus-oriented, and so on. And in addition, the last panel that we had and that just ended this last weekend was on tackling hatred in society. You will not be surprised to hear that a panel that was addressing tackling hatred in society, organized by the Commission in the spring of 2024, did not talk about Palestine at all. They didn't mention it at all. The only reference happened at the very end of the panel, once the recommendations were already finished. There was this Spanish lady, I'm here reclaiming my Spanish identity as well, that said, well, there's one thing that I did not have the chance to say before, and it's I want the EU to stop its relation to Israel because they are undertaking a massacre on Palestine. And I think it is precisely this that illustrates some of the tensions that happen when we imagine democracy in this very, I think, narrow and closed way, as opposed to the encampment that, and I know that EUI has been very supportive as well of the encampment. So I'm very happy as well about that, and also, of course, touches on this the colonial dimension. But what is more interesting to me is, in some ways, they are also innovating in democracy. This is a democratic innovation, what is happening in the encampment. There is a theoretical kind of imagination that can be drawn upon those experiences. And here, whereas on one side, you have a very delimited kind of boundary of who is the we, right? We select the participants by sortition. This person is legitimate, this person is not. This person is a European citizen, because of course, if you're not an EU citizen, then you cannot participate, right? Versus a much more fluid, we're not asking IDs, this is about doing something together. And of course, it also reivindicates and reclaims some content. This is not a neutral, apolitical kind of process. So I think this kind of contrast between these citizen panels and the encampment might give some food for thought for the discussion. So maybe I will just end it here, and thank you all for listening.
Very much, and I think we all have a lot of ideas and questions that we want to address. But before, I just wanted to introduce Virginia and ask her, since we ended with this strong image here, if you could, I don't know, maybe tell us something about this, maybe this delegitimization and your experience as well, the recent one. Do you need a clicker?
No.
Okay, perfect. So I would leave this image.
So I guess all of us will have an angle on Alvaro's book, so I'm happy that you started where I wanted to start, even without too much conversation. So first of all, I met Alvaro in 2020 when, with Nicola, we launched this coalition called the Citizens Takeover Europe, which is still now a network of over 70 NGOs, civil society groups. And back then, the Conference on the Future of Europe was announced and then postponed because of the pandemic. And one of our claims was that in times of emergency, we need more democracy than less democracy. So we started this network to advocate for the start of the Conference on the Future of Europe, recognizing voting power. And also as a coalition, we were watchdogs of the process alongside the Transnational Democracy Cluster here at the UI. So I'm happy to be also one of the subjects in a way of Alvaro. Before asking my question, I want to highlight 3 concepts and methodological lenses that I found in the book that I think are very important. The first one is this element of passive revolution and agonistic politics. The second is the methodological aspect of the grounded theory, so start being in the field and then transform it into a theoretical framework. And this idea of the need for the coexistence between transnationalism and decoloniality, which is a point that, thanks to Alvaro, I learned to explore. So the first concept is the title, Democracy Without Politics. I argue that we are heading towards a democracy without people, particularly if we look only at the representative side of democracy. The abstention rates at the election is a key element of that. And I think his definition of passive revolution that it takes from Gramsci needs to be read out loud. A top-down process by which a political system appears to change by shifting its democratic legitimacy claims while maintaining existing power structures. And I think if we look at those who take part in politics and democracy in the representative space, we have a lot of excluded people. Usually this exclusion is based on class and race. And I think the fact that Alvaro highlights this aspect is quite important. And at the same time, I think it's very important the way how we showcase the tension between the social movements activation, recognizing the importance of taking advantage of institutional opportunities within the EU. It doesn't deny that these type of processes, or like the European citizen initiatives, are important mechanisms. The second concept I was mentioning, this grounded theory approach, he quotes Hammond, who says, democratic theory must democratize its practices towards more self-reflective and open forms of theory development. Already Calypso talked about the importance of activist theorizing, but I want to highlight how the work that Alvaro did in his participant observation was also a push for us as activists to self-reflect on our practices. A lot of the organizations that are part of Citizens Recover Europe are somehow NGOs belonging, like it or not, to the bubble, so I think his push was a reflection on our positionality as NGO people, as professional activists. And for me, for sure, this was a very powerful tool, and your body was very helpful to understand how my body was involved in the bubble or outside the bubble, and the privileges that I had, for example, in my position in Brussels. And the third concept is this need of coupling the transnational activist approach with the decolonial posture. And I think this needs to be analyzed also because the NGOization of the European public sphere sometimes have an approach where subjects are beneficiaries of grants and projects rather than actions of solidarity, action of co-imagining and designing together actions. So I think this is an angle that maybe I feel in your work. So I come to my question. As you might know, I was one of the UI people that were in the Piazza San Marco, now Shirin Abu Akleh Square. And I think the 10th movement is something that needs to be looked carefully because it combines, for sure in the Florence case, the transnational dimension. We were students from the UI, from SNS, Normale, and from the University of Florence, and our national identity was the least important part of the action. And I think also the fact that the encampments were for Palestine, for something that is both a subject and an object of solidarity, put the center outside of Europe, the center of the action. So I will be interested to hear your take on this decolonial transitional aspect, if you see that. I also want to add another level, which is how, as European citizens, the major part of us, not only, we could imagine leveraging some of the instruments of direct democracies that are available within the EU. The action is very much horizontal and mobilizing, but there are aspects of the accessibility of the European Union. So we could call for a European citizen panel on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. We could launch a European citizen initiative. There are a few actions that potentially we have available, the part of us that are EU citizens. So is this something to be looked at? And in general, is there hope for this type of movements to influence the policy-making and lawmaking processes, or the destiny is to be a force in the public sphere, but without any influential power? So that's my considerations and questions for Alvaro.
Thank you very much, Virginia. And thank you, Alvaro, for taking notes. So now I will leave the floor to someone who is daily committed to promoting democracy, culture, equality, Nicolò Milanese.
Thanks. Thanks for that generous introduction, and it's a privilege to be both a subject of the book and also allowed to speak about it. It's been suggested that I speak from a decolonial perspective, which I'm not sure I'm qualified to do, but nonetheless, I'll try to make three points from that perspective, which addresses the couplet which is on the cover, which you mobilize throughout the book, this decolonial multitude, right, as your conceptualization of a kind of alternative subject, political subject inside of Europe. And I suppose the first thing I have to say about that couplet is that there is a risk associated with it by re-signifying or rereading decolonialism in let's say the Republican tradition, which perhaps could be most associated with Machiavelli. You mobilize him in the book. We're in Florence, and obviously has lots to say about multitudes. And I think the risk with re-signifying decolonialism inside of that Republican tradition is that decolonialism or decolonial multitude could be thought of as one side of the dialectic between the elite and the people. If it is thought inside of that dialectic, then there's a risk that the genuinely revolutionary aspects of decolonialism and the heritage of Marxist-Leninism or Maoism or the other revolutionary currents which animated a lot of 19th and 20th century decolonialism is abstracted from, or this revolutionary horizon risks being lost, and the multitude, the colonial multitude, is positioned as a kind of counterpower in a Rosenwaldian kind of way, another part of the Republican tradition. And so I think that the risk with that is not to pose the question of what it would mean for a decolonial multitude to take power. And of course, that's a difficult question to think about in a European context, because the heritage of decolonialism is about taking power in the colonies. But if one's thinking about a decolonial multitude in Europe, what would it mean to take power in Europe? So that's my first kind of reflection. The second reflection is that nonetheless, inside of the Republican tradition, as Calypso has already gestured towards, there is perhaps some useful thought, notably about multitudes. And the figure that most interests me, or that I think is most fascinating because he's so ambiguous in relation with our topic, is that of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who you might have in mind, and you'd be right to have in mind, as someone who is critical of representation, and so is in favor of citizens assembling to make the social contract in a kind of immediate way. And as many people here will also know, believes that it can only be men that do that. All of the dimension of care and mutual support and so on that goes behind the Le Peuple meeting in the social contract appears to be abstracted from, and so and is extremely critical as well of any intermediary powers, right? The citizens who meet in the assembly to make the social contract should be just there as individuals with no ties to civil society. And so there's something which resembles a little bit the imaginary behind something like the citizens' panels, even if they were more diverse than Rousseau would have allowed them to be. But nonetheless, Rousseau is constantly sort of wavering between this conception of the people and his awareness that this people is a kind of impossible people and relies upon a multitude which surrounds it, a multitude which includes women and carers and children and all sorts of other people. And he in fact mobilizes that term most notably in his letter to D'Alembert in 1758, so 3 or 4 years before Social Contract was published, in which you'll remember he criticizes D'Alembert's praise of theatres in Geneva. D'Alembert wrote an article about Geneva, very important place for Rousseau, and he's angry with theatres because they're a place of representation, they happen in the dark, the audience is passive, it's not in the public space. He criticizes all of that, but he then talks about festivals and public assemblies, and he even praises street theatre people because they move between places and they're acting in the public space and they create spectacles in which also the public is part of the spectacle, an immediate kind of relationship between people. And this is the space of the multitude. And in a rich rereading of Rousseau, which has been led in France by people like Bernard Berardi or Bruno Carcenti, this is actually the space of Lumière, which makes the reasoning possible inside of the social contract. And so there is perhaps resources inside of the Republican tradition to rethink the relationships between multitude and people. Another aspect that Rousseau insists on, which I think is relevant here, is understanding democracy as something which is not countable, is not in the regime of the countable. Unlike for Aristotle, aristocracy, which is countable because it's about the few governing the many, or tyranny, which is about one governing everybody. Rousseau is constantly fighting with this idea that democracy is not about counting things. It's about actually the power to act, and who has the power to act. And I think this is also something colonial, decolonial that we have to investigate. So that's my second series of remarks. The third series of remarks is about the place of Europe, and it is that it would of course be mistaken to think that Europe is in any way hegemonic in today's world. Every day it's clearer the extent to which Europe is no longer a hegemon. And so the action of a decolonial multitude inside of Europe, I think it has to fall into question where Europe is not necessarily the hegemon. So what kind of action would be appropriate for a decolonial multitude trying to influence or take power inside of Europe, which is not itself a hegemonic power anymore? I think, to cut it short, that one of the things that it would be most preoccupied with is the inclusion of the outside of Europe into the inside. And that also relates with something that Calypso has been talking about, which is the importance of Europe including people from outside of Europe, wherever that is, inside its deliberations. And that also speaks, I think, to what Virginia was just saying about all these ways in which we try to decenter in the movements political concern of Europe to include spaces which are formally outside of it. So those are my three remarks.
Thank you very much. So just not to run out of time, I just give the floor to another Nicolas, this time for Nicolas now.
The name
is in the system.
Yeah, we know.
Sorry, I just want people to know your real name.
Well, so I wanted to start as Virginia when I met Álvaro. I met Álvaro during the ECPs actually because I was working as an assistant to the facilitating team in the Virtual Worlds European Citizens Panel. And I wanted to deliver this reflection on the idea of the citizens' assemblies, in this case the ECPs, as a socialization space, because there was a common element there put forward by the Commission. Participant citizens were also kind of going to Brussels for the first time, and it was the first time that they went to the EU institutions. And during my thesis, I have been able to interview most of the organizers of the ECPs, and they all agree on this idea of the socialization aspect being a side effect or a byproduct, something that, in my opinion, has been overstated. But I wanted to talk about it because, first of all, obviously there was a clear self-selection bias. The Eurosceptic attitudes were sidelined because there was no attitudinal element involved in the selection of the participants, or as we say in our article, the top-down process was evident, or as you say, it was kind of a bubble-like setting. So I think that the socialization idea has to be, I don't know, at least not supported that much. But I think that it's a good point to start an idea of what are the socialization spaces that we have in the EU actually. I think that apart from spaces as that one, as mostly non-critical of the European Union, or even blindly supporting what, in this case, the Commission is doing, we have little spaces for socialization in the European Union. And my idea with this was on what role should the universities play here. I'm a master's student here at the STG, and obviously it is not only about the STG, but it's also, let's talk about the College of Europe, let's talk about any other European Union department in any European university. Maybe if my point of view is that it's one of the main spaces for European Union socialization, as we don't have EU curricula at schools, so it's a perfect place on EU socialization, but this socialization is coming again as a mostly non-critical, and I feel, and I have talked about this with a lot of colleagues, of being formed as kind of to substitute or to occupy the spaces of power that are normally occupied by other people in the Commission. And my idea was are these universities, well, the STG, College of Europe, any other European university, a place for only elite reproduction or elite socialization? I think that we need a reflection, and it's really linked to your idea on your book, especially on the cover, the idea of the lock. Who are we keeping away from these spaces? That we need really a reflection, and I wanted to know your point on the socialization in these spaces, the curricula that we're putting forward, the relationship of these universities with power, or also the output that we are delivering. How do we ensure that universities are another space for politicization, or how can they contribute to the creation of or at least to the building of the European Union public sphere and to democratization in general? Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas, very much. Now, just give the floor to Mine, last but not least, I would say. Thank you.
Very much. I need to read my notes to avoid any misunderstanding. I would like to thank you, Alvaro, for your mind-opening conceptual framework. It was quite impressive, even though in your book, your case is more focused on EU. I think the concept you offered as a political imaginary, the colonial multitude, is very inspiring in different contexts. Since I was thinking about my own country, Turkey, while reading the book, I would like to reflect on your conceptual proposal for Turkey, in particular the historical anti-colonial struggle of Kurdish people. And I will try to address two key points based on your conceptual framework. First, I will discuss how the gender dimension of the colonial multitude is born through the struggle of women from the inside of movement. And secondly, I will emphasize the importance of different social struggles engaging with each other in order to create these multiple dimensions. In Turkey, the Kurdish movement represents the most historical example of anti-colonial struggle against the colonial occupation of the Turkish state. The Kurdish people, whose language is still banned, have been struggling for decades against the states of policy of expropriation, assimilation, as well as against ecological destruction of their land. They have been fighting for democracy and the right to equal citizenship for decades. But while struggling, they have been also improving the democratic understanding of governance from the bottom up in their organizational structures and forms of governance, as if they have been dreaming for years. They have many good examples, but one of the most impressive ones is that women have an equal voices and representation in every field at both institutional and organizational levels. However, it was gained through the struggle of Kurdish women from the bottom up. Women's struggle in a society where religion and cultural conservatism are quite determinant brought the movement a multitude dimension, but at the same time shifted the patriarchal understanding of their male comrades. Thanks to women's struggle from inside, intersectionality has been integrated into the anti-colonial struggle. I think this case also represents the importance of struggling from the inside to import deliberative democratic methodologies into social movements. And I want to share another case to reflect the importance of building a decolonial multitude by creating links between different struggles and movements. This case also reflects how it can be difficult to create links between different movements because of internalized colonial mindset. The only group in Turkey that can openly support the Kurdish movement without any conditions is the majority of feminist movement. It has historically been challenging for the majority of other social movements to engage with and openly support this anti-colonial struggle. The reason why the majority of the other social movements don't support the Kurdish movement in Turkey is that the state has systematically criminalized the Kurds and their struggle. In other words, we can articulate this situation as the internalization of the colonial idea and tend to think like the colonial state. The failure of left-wing movements and social democrats in Turkey, in particular, to develop the colonial multitude ties with Kurdish movement, has been costly for all, unfortunately. Since these links and anti-colonial solidarity couldn't be enabled with Kurds, the Erdogan regime was able to establish its one-man rule. The turning point for the current authoritarian regime in Turkey was 9 years ago, when the state declared a state of emergency and appointed trustees to Kurdish municipalities. Unfortunately, today, the whole country is still run under a state of emergency, which means the law is still suspended. Erdogan increased his brutality by taking advantage of this failure. I mean, failure to support the Kurdish struggle. From this crucial moment, it is clear that all democratic institutions and channels where you can express your democratic demands and raise your voice are now without politics. And the last verse from me. History has shown us that all despots and single-man regimes come and go. I believe that one of the biggest struggles of coming years for us will be to reshape our democratic values from the bottom up by creating links between different struggles inside the country. We must also move on to transnational solidarity, as you suggested, since we are living in a time of transnational disasters and democratic backsliding. Thank you very much for opening this space.
For the sake of participation, I would just move now from the panelists to the audience to gather some questions. And also, I'm also looking at the online participants, but yeah.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I'm, after listening to you, even more concerned with the state of democracy of the EU than I was before, I must say. And if I follow your account, I would say that participatory democracy is in a kind of crisis. We witnessed the kind of failure of civil society to make a meaningful contribution to EU democracy in the form of partnership governance, as this was promoted by the EU 2 decades ago. And now, following your account, we witness the failure of citizen panels and this citizen turn, as you called it. And especially this last development of launching citizen panels as a kind of a legitimatory tool of the Commission seemed to be rather worrying, I would call this. But what does this mean then? Do we need a new representative turn now? Think of better representative institution that would inevitably bring us back to the governments and the kind of intergovernmental turn again? Or do we need to think of better participation? And here you gave some ideas at the end of your talk about these new forms of protest. I didn't like, however, this way how you opposed a deliberation with political protest or with political activism. So if you think of these camps on Piazza San Marco, I would claim that there was a lot of deliberation going on Piazza San Marco. And I would say that these protesters do not legitimize through protest action. They legitimize because they show that they bring new arguments, that they have maybe better argument, or that they challenge existing arguments. So we need to think of political activism as closely related to deliberation and not as opposites. And finally, if I may, I would also have some thoughts about this idea of a post-colonial multitude. My approach to this question, how to imagine the people of democracy, was always a pragmatic one, in a sense of John Dewey and others, where we would say that the people are constituted simply by expressing shared concerns. These are people that claim to be affected by a particular exercise of power or by a particular policy. And this is a very pragmatic approach that leaves the question, who are the people in terms of political community, or in statistical terms, simply completely open. And if we accept such a notion, I would say that the people are simply the voice that claims to be heard against power and against government. And if the people are simply voice, we could also say the people are discourse and not much more. And from that perspective, I would say that it does no longer matter to introduce the new notion of post-colonial multitude. If this voice is expressed as by promoting post-colonial discourse, it would be a legitimate way to challenge political power.
Thank you. So, you also want to present yourself?
Yeah. I'm Jonathan Zeitlin. I'm a visiting fellow at the Schumann Center. I just one quick remark about the interesting point that you just raised, Hans-Jörg. Dewey talked about publics, not about peoples, and that's how he defined publics. And so I think quite relevant here. But I mean, I want to, Calypso, you said at the beginning that there might be a risk of too much agreement on the panel. So let me introduce a little bit of a note of disagreement in the following way. Something that struck me, Alvaro, is that you invoke politics a lot in the presentation. I haven't been able to read the book yet, though I've read some of your other work, but you don't define politics. You didn't in the presentation. And at the end, it became apparent, or it seemed to become apparent, that for you, politics is agonism, is contestation, is conflict. And I wonder, I mean, that, you know, there's a long tradition of thinking about it that way, but it's certainly not the only way to think about it. And I'm not sure it's the most helpful way to think about it if we want to understand how citizens and citizen deliberation could be involved, could be active in the EU. So, you know, if we look at the literature about this in other settings, mini-publics and deliberations, one could make the claim that what they're really good for is precisely taking highly polarized, contested, controversial issues and finding new consensus about how to move forward, which can then be taken up in the representative political sphere. The example of abortion in Ireland would be the canonical one, but there are other ones. And you know, I find that actually attractive, and given the pluralism and the divisions at multiple levels in the EU, I've always thought that a conception of politics as agonistic contestation or politicization as agonistic contestation is dangerous for the EU, not helpful for the EU. That we need politics in terms of deliberation, in terms of justification, being able to debate different kinds of justification. And so, you know, I'm a bit puzzled whether this is the right way to go. None of that is to say that, I mean, I was also horrified, as Hans-Jörg was, by your description of this kind of new wave of very focused, narrow citizens panels. That doesn't seem to be a good example. But I wonder if you can really, you know, defend better and more explicitly why this agonistic conception of politics is the right approach to politicization of policymaking in the EU.
So thank you very much. Since we have a lot on the table, before I give it the floor to you and here, Alvaro, do you want to sum up something from the panelists before we give the answer?
Yes.
You need to leave. So let's take the last question and then we give the...
I never saw it, yeah. Very quickly, I just wanted to, drawing on the idea of the theater, just maybe one of the contrasts to think about is the very different style and nature of a collective conversation that we have as citizens, and the raison, not raison d'état, raison d'institution, the kind of style of deliberation that is within a political assembly like the Commission, where I was there too, by the way, at the panels. And the extraordinary contrast there is between what we are used to as a free fluid conversation, where you can arrive at deliberation collectively, in this space a free theater in a way, and versus this kind of very constituted theatrical space that is a space for representation of so-called representation of citizen conversations. And the two, in a sense, can't gel, but maybe that's the point. What happens to this conversation that when we are in that context is what I'm thinking of. And the other concept I want to bring in, just a kind of something I'm starting to think about as well, is the idea of comfort zones. That in a sense, each of us are existing within comfort zones of our own opinions, our own habits, our own whatever, identity constructed or whatever. And because the deliberation is about the comfort zones actually opening up and trying to, and the thing is, when you look at the kind of language of technocrats, that they have their own comfort zones as well. They have to say their own what happens again to that? So if we try to change things to get out of comfort zones, that's what citizens are for. How does that work?
Okay, Alvaro and someone else, Calypso, do you want to also step in, and then we finish with the last question.
So okay. So thanks so much for thanks for the question. So thanks everyone for all the questions and comments. I'm not sure I will be able to address them all, but maybe I was thinking maybe I could start with Jonathan's because I think it links up well with also Nicolas, because yes, indeed, my conception of politics is one of agonism, contestation, politicization, and I mean, I didn't have time to do it in the presentation. And what is interesting to me is as well that you come as well from the perspective that this type of understanding of politics can be dangerous or harmful for the EU. And here's where I think that in some ways, sometimes within EU studies, we have been in some ways too close to institutions and thinking that some of the work that we are doing has to be somehow helpful for institutions or for the EU. And I'm not sure that my work necessarily has to be helpful for the EU. I mean, I am of course critical, and in some ways I support some type of EU, but I definitely don't necessarily support this type of EU, right? So maybe it is not bad to as well think of ways in which we can also upset the established way of thinking about the EU. And this, I think, responds very closely to what Nicolas was saying about the universities as a space of knowledge production, but also as a space of socialization. And in some ways, I think European Studies Institute, but also College of Europe and other spaces that have had a tendency towards reproducing some ways of thinking that very closely match this kind of more technocratic, and many of the people indeed working and that have done their masters end up in some ways in Brussels working as lobbyists. And I mean, I don't criticize it, but I think it is indeed important to take stock of that and say, well, is our work really to be helpful for the EU? I mean, yeah, I might, I will probably not be invited by the Commission to a high-level working group on participatory democracy, but I think, maybe that's okay. So, yeah. Okay, so this was the first one, and I think, relatedly, I think that, and that's why I also ended up with the kind of contrast between the encampment and the citizen panels. The encampment, Hans-Jörg, I didn't put it as a kind of contrast of deliberation, but of the specific ways in which deliberation is conceived in the context of the panels. So I think that's slightly kind of differently. So that was a little bit the idea, but also linking up the encampment and seeing it as a democratic innovation. I'm also very happy that, for example, Mine has also seen some of the Kurdish and the anti-colonial struggles in Turkey as well embedded in it, because indeed, and this responds as well to Nicolo, the point of the decolonial multitude is not as a subject in Europe of the EU, right? I mean, can we really have democracy in the EU but not elsewhere, right? And here this responds to the logic in which, in some ways, we may be thinking too much in terms of how to make democracy within the EU better, but what if the global material structures that in some ways are oppressing people across the world are not necessarily, only European, right? I mean, capitalism and a lot of these big companies are not necessarily uniquely European. So in some ways, the decolonial multitude is an attempt to conceptualize how to build up and connect some of these struggles that could be somehow helpful to emancipation of people across the world, not only in the EU. Of course, the empirical focus is on the EU, and I am not legitimate to talk about India or other countries or Palestine. That's not my expertise, right? So the empirical part is based indeed on the conversations and the Conference on the Future of Europe, but the kind of conceptual understanding through which I see these struggles is indeed one that is decolonial, and the decolonial, in my way, is necessarily transnational, necessarily encompasses beyond the EU. So this is maybe what I wanted to say, and maybe to respond to Virginia about the tension between movements and institutions. I think there is definitely clearly a tension there. I don't think we can necessarily resolve that tension, and indeed, being active in movements, but also in some ways in institutions is a helpful way forward. I am not sure at the same time that EU instruments can be super helpful. I mean, it depends. I think it depends on the context, but broadly, I think most of the hope that I see comes from the outside. I mean, we were also with Niccolo recently in Marseille on the European Common Space for Alternatives, a kind of attempt to revive the European Social Forum. I think that sort of space might, I mean, nothing materially will happen tomorrow, but you know, the linkages that happen and the encompassing of different struggles, you know, how, you know, Kurdish and Palestine and other struggles can be brought together to put pressure basically on institutions. That's it.
Okay. Nick, do you want to add something before we take the other questions? Or?
Well, a couple of points. One is to Alvaro, but the room, you know. When you put all of your reasoning under the umbrella of democracy without politics, don't you put too much weight on this one understanding of politics, to echo Jonathan? And what about good old democracy? And you yourself, then later, in some other places, well, there's not enough democratization, but you still call this democracy without politics. So what you reify in this whole story is indeed a certain understanding of democracy. I mean, I wonder, because of course, I would argue that indeed this is not democracy, pure and simple. What we're observing is consultation. These are mega focus groups. And indeed, the whole culture, where did we get to this whole thing? Because of this kind of mini publics. That was like a way of saying, Fishkin, you know, we're doing surveys with like calling up people, well, let's bring them in a room and survey them. But they should talk a bit before their survey to become a bit more intelligent. But the logic is that of survey, it's that of consultation. It's not democracy as in you really basically take your destiny in your hands. So I have a small issue about the fact that you're not demanding enough. I know you want to be super radical and everything, but you're not demanding enough in what you want to ask democracy. And therefore, in that sense, and I mean, I'm sure you know that we kind of agree, but the terms do matter. And relatedly, a term that does matter is radical, because the culture that you criticize and we all criticize, the citizen turn, the idea that it's good to have these atomized citizens who somehow don't have to be conscious of all the struggles that have gone before them. If democracy is one thing, it's the accumulation over time of struggles that build on each other. And these citizens, most of the time, don't know, don't care, or do, but it's very rare. And what really irks me is that you cite Claudia Schwelitz or Landemore or this movement, I mean, are painted as the radicals, but they're not radical. They're technocratic. They're why are they painted as radical? So we need to push back against that in the vocabulary that we use. I mean, I've had intense conversation. It's very clear. What you say is very, very clear. There's an understanding that this is good because indeed it bypasses, politics. But then just in terms, I'm going through semantics here. Politicization. So that politicization 20 years ago, we remember, sort of a big debate in European studies. What is good politicization? What is bad politicization? There's a whole, story there. And it becomes bad when it's polarization, as in people don't talk to one another, and it's the bad politics, right? And you can't really get to the consensus that the EU is supposed to get to. And maybe we want to buy that. I mean, there's an issue when that's politicization. But if politicization is about reflecting in the public sphere the fact that there are social cleavages all over the place, and that these social cleavages need to be explicit in the public conversation, then it's good politicization. But that politicization is indeed compatible with, well, I would say, ambivalence, owning up to your ambivalence, which is what happens in these assemblies. And in that sense, they're good, because there are spaces where people are allowed to be ambivalent. And if you listen to the conversation, they feel it's okay. They're not protesting. They're not in San Marcos Square. They are like, okay, I think that and I think that. I think this is good. and then compromise and consensus. Well, these terms need to be, unpacked. But this is why I argue what we're talking about is a very partial, biased process of partial democratization, not democracy, technocratic democratization. That's how we write about it with Nicolas. And so it's not, how we use that. And final point, on the decolonial versus, I was struck by what Nicolas said about, well, the decolonial is first and foremost in the colony. And how we appropriate for European publics the term decolonial is difficult. It's quite a challenge. Now, I think the concern about intersectionality, inclusiveness, porousness, the other within, etc., is really important. The idea that Europe needs to decolonize, that Europe needs to be post-colonial is important. But how far do we want to go in calling a crowd of good old ordinary citizens Europeans, even when there are civil society organizations and trade unions and everyone we kind of like as in favor of bottom-up democracy? Now, how far do we want to appropriate the fact that it's decolonial? It's a European multitude, yes, and at the global level, we need to be post-colonial. But can Europeans really be dreamt of as post-colonial or decolonial? Dreamt of, yes, but I think I'm just kind of saying in much less articulate way what Nicolas was saying earlier, or at least asking the question of whether we can, do that.
Thanks a lot, Calypso. So I collected last two questions, one here and one there, and then we see if we have time for the last two.
Hello, Jacopo Custodi from Scuola Normale Superiore. Thank you very much, Alvaro. First of all, it was a very convincing presentation. I really enjoyed that. I just have a question and a comment. The question is whether you think or not that there is actually an European Union exceptionality in what you were describing, because like most of the trends that you discussed are also very much present at national levels. Think about private consultancy, the legitimation of intermediate collective actors, corporations that teach us how to be good citizens, and all this stuff, that are basically like post-democratic trends. So I wanted to know if you think that the European Union is still different somehow from those like trends that we see also at national level, or it's basically the same thing. And the comment I have, it's on the decolonial adjective that you put there. I probably expected this. Because, decoloniality is kind of a buzzword right now, but I think we need to agree what we mean with that, because if we mean with decoloniality like contemporary decolonial thought, decolonial theories, thinking of Mignolo, Quijano, and so on, I have some problems with them, to be honest, and maybe we can discuss that, but the point is that I struggle to see why they are so useful for your argument that I buy 100%. I'm totally on your side on the argument you put forward. I just don't see why this decolonial thought, at least if we follow that trend, is so necessary. So it's just a provocation, like how would you convince someone who is critical of decolonial thought, as myself, that is actually important to sustain your argument?
Thank you, Alvaro. My name is Salvador Lima. I'm a computer outsider. I'm not a European citizen, and I come from the history department, so my question might be...
You're the perfect person.
Very well. But I was listening to you, and I was wondering if what you think. Is it possible to make a more democratic and politicized European Union without a very deep reform of the European institutions, without a reform of the European Constitution? Because I mean, there is less democracy maybe in the European institutions because there is no demand for democracy. European citizens I'm not sure they understand quite well what Brussels does, and they might have good reason for that, because welfare, security, taxation, immigration, it's in hands of national states still. For 99% of people, the national state is still the main political horizon. So how do you create a demand for more democracy, for more politicization in Europe, if people don't see the mission of these institutions. So my question is, can you do this without weakening the national states and strengthening this way the European institutions?
Perfect. So we can collect last two questions.
Hi. So it's always a pleasure to listen to you. Thanks for this. So I had a couple of questions, but I will just focus on one, and then we will discuss the others later. So you mentioned the role of private actors. So indeed, you have a lot of consultancies, but the thing is that it's tricky as a category, consultancy, and you have a lot of different actors that can act as consultants, especially in this field. And research shows that a lot of them, they act also as civil society, or you have a lot of academics within those groups. So can you tell us more about this private category you use and its effects on decision making as you grasp it? Also, by taking into account that you have a lot of conflicts within those teams, between the actors, within also the consultancies, right? So thanks.
Great.
Yes, please. So, first of all, a million thanks, for this fascinating presentation, although I must say it was very scary. Sorry?
Introduce yourself.
Deborah Spini, New York University in Florence. Outsider as well. Absolutely outsider. And actually, my first question is perhaps it's a little blunt, but about the decolonial dimension. I would say, don't you think that perhaps immigration policies are indeed the field where we measure the possibility of thinking of a decolonial European Union? It is somehow where, the possibility of decolonizing really stands or falls. Also because it seems to me that, you can think whatever you want of Mignola, Quijano, and whatever, but the essence of the decolonial operation is also to teach Europe that nothing of our political agency, of our political theories, of, who we are, can be thought without taking into consideration the colonial lens. And I would say that, immigration issues perhaps can be the field where this is revealed, and I would like to know what you're thinking about it. My second question somehow has been, how can I say, sabotaged by Calypso, because you, Calypso, no, this is serious, you provided a very important, helpful differentiation between politicization and polarization. And I take it. Yes, and this is my question also for the panelists. I would say what I really cannot make sense of is this very puzzling combination of lack of relevance of the European institution. In fact, I think it was Virginia that also reminded the fact people don't go and vote to the European elections, so we have an issue of non-relevance. On the other hand, it seems to me that the European Union issues are as present as ever in the political propaganda, in the political discourse, than of national political parties. Because, when Salvini says we want to have, we don't want le macchine elettriche as in the European Union, you see that somehow, even in the, how can I say, rougher, if you want, sectors of Italian public opinion, the European Union is present in a way that probably was not present, let's say, 15 years ago. So how do you make sense, I would say, of this kind of contradiction? Third, I would like to hear something, because, when in your excellent presentation you showed the slide about Ursula von der Leyen saying the inward-looking logic of political parties, I was very surprised that all the members of the European Parliament didn't say, how do you dare?
It was not von der Leyen, that was Claudia Schwalisch.
Sorry, Claudia. But, and this is also, I would say, very, very significant, because, this kind of just taken for granted that, political parties are there. I can't even say for decoration because they're not decorational. This is also a major, how can I say, abdication to a genuine construction of European democracy. E poi the colonial side is that one, because here we are under the sign of the Cavalieri di Santo Stefano that were instituted by the Medici to make sure that, their trade in the Mediterranean was not disturbed. So that's the colonial.
3 seconds, and then we have to close.
Okay, a very quick question. I just wanted to ask you what you think the role of Citizens Panel is in democracy. Because just this morning there was an event where we tried to motivate kind of 130 Tuscan first-time voters to vote actually in the EU elections. And then we did this feedback session at the end, and many of them said something like, I cannot imagine anything that relates me to the European Union, which was quite shocking actually. But I was kind of wondering what this means for our concept of democracy, because I kind of take democracy as something bigger that includes things like representative democracy, collective regulation, political activism as means, kind of democratic means of expression. And then you have democracy as a bigger concept that kind of brings them together, and the box between then kind of also citizens panels could be one of these means in this way, or also education, by the way. So kind of this was the question.
If you want to wrap up.
Yes, so thanks again for all the questions and comments. Yes, I'm bound to disappoint with my responses because there are too many things, but maybe I'll just try to go just by a little bit by order. So thanks, Calixto, for the comments again. So maybe just to clarify, this idea of democracy without politics is not an understanding that democracy can exist without politics, but rather that the imaginary of democracy that the EU mobilizes is one that does not have politics. So that's why even the cover is kind of in cursive letters, just because it's not my understanding of democracy, it's how I think that the Commission and EU institutions think about democracy. And that's how it connects a little bit with Vivian Schmidt's idea of policy without politics, in that sense. But I basically, yeah, I agree with it. It's a mega focus group. Yeah, basically that's a thing. On your question that was connected to Nicolo, I mean, it's true that there is a risk of appropriating the decolonial within Europe. At the same time, I also think that decolonization is not something that can only happen outside of Europe. I mean, there is a lot of decolonization still needed to be done within Europe, because in some ways the EU remains taking advantage of trade deals, of establishing unequal relations with other actors in terms of natural resources, trade, etc., etc. And also, of course, this relates to Deborah's question about migration, which is an obvious case in point, right? So we will do trade deals with certain countries, but at the same time, we will make sure that no people can travel, right? So we want those countries to be able to supply us with food, but at the same time, surely not with people, right? So I think in that way, that tension does exist. Then, Jacque, I really like the question. Is there an EU exceptionality about this? I don't claim that. I don't think necessarily there's an EU exceptionality, but I do think there's something specific about the EU that fits particularly well with this imaginary of democracy. Because the EU has developed this very consensus technocratic understanding of democracy, this type of culture, I think, fits rather well. The citizen panels and so on. So, I mean, I would not go as far to say there is an EU exceptionality on this, but I do think there is something that fits and that makes sense to look at it in the EU. And then for the second question, it's true, I could have told this story about the conference and the panels and citizen participation without the decolonial aspect. At the same time, I mean, to be fair, we don't have time, but I mean, I'm a long time kind of fan of Michael Hart and Toni Negri, who were the ones that put forward this idea of the multitude long time ago, that they mobilized Spinoza, Machiavelli, and so on. They don't look at Europe at all. They have a more global perspective. And basically, I think that there are some relevant decolonial critiques of that approach, because it does not necessarily incorporate this decolonial aspect. But why is it useful? I think it's useful because a lot of the imaginary of democracy upon which the panels are constructed is also based on this idea that Athens was where democracy was born, right? Sortition and so on. And I think it would be good to question some of those things, right? Because, I mean, what were the material conditions upon which Athens built that, right? Who were the ones who were selected? Were women? Were the slaves, etc., right? And I think that's where the decolonial aspect fits particularly well in that sense. And I mean, also I used quite a lot for the book this idea that David Graeber and David Wenger, they wrote this book, The Dawn of Everything, where basically they sort of trace the process whereby we articulate our notions of democracy and so on, and why maybe there were also alternatives that we could think of as spaces where democracy emerged, that are not necessarily full deliberation and so on, and full representation, right? And yeah, so I think that's why I think I needed the decolonial, and also I also wanted to write something on more conceptual about it, and I think that was a good opportunity to that. So there's also some pragmatism about that, don't deny that. Then maybe just to quickly to Salvador and Marilu. To Salvador, I mean, I think that there is demand for democracy. I mean, the thing is that it doesn't have to be demand specifically for EU democracy. And I think, I'm not convinced about the diagnosis that most of the welfare states still depend on the national level. I mean, there's a lot of interrelation between the national and the European, from the European semester. I mean, Jonathan also here has worked a lot on that, and I think there's a close interaction between what happens with the national and the European. So there is a need to create some sort of accountability processes at the European level. And I think there is demand. I think there is demand. Maybe there's not demand for specifically EU democracy in those words, but I think that's where kind of the movement, I think, goes. And maybe just last to Marilu, the private actors are really fascinating actors, and there are some kind of tensions between. And notably because the experts on deliberation, in fact, are the consultants, not the commission, right? But there's, and in the conference, the interinstitutional, but the interaction between them was really fascinating to see. In some ways, you see the limits that even these consultancies, you may think that the consultants are the bad guys. If you look at the way in which it works, in fact, most of the consultants are in some ways more democratically oriented than some actors within the institutions. And this is fascinating to see. So in the commission, they set up this quote-unquote knowledge committee that selects a number of experts that guides and makes kind of the framing of the discussion, right? Some of the consultants are aware that, you know, we cannot select just people that agree with the commission. The commission keeps, you know, pushing that to select, you know, some specific groups that, in fact, yeah, they reproduce what the commission does. So there's some NGOs, yes, there's some NGOs, but there are those NGOs that we know will not necessarily challenge some of the structures or some of the basis of our proposals.
So, Alva, thank you.
Yes.
Good news for us.
I just wanted to share that if you want after the drink, as we mentioned, the encampment of Florence, so there is no more tents, but we're gathering with some of the people that did the encampment for a moment of mourning for the Rafah attacks of this morning and also for being together. Our idea is that the place is still a place for discussion and dialogue, so also if you want to meet the people that animated the encampment, it's a good place to have a drink. And so it's a combination of joy and sadness, so you're more than welcome to come there with someone.